Police Chief William Bratton made his name cleaning up New York City with the controversial broken windows theory of crime reduction. Safer cities helped him implement that same policy in his new hometown.
The same tactics that was used in the broken windows theory in New York, Bratton brought that same concept out here. The same way he gentrified New York is the same way he planned on gentrifying California.
That theory, which has been widely criticized by academics and folks in the community, says that if you put a lot of resources into fighting very minor crimes, that you will then impact serious crime.
So I want to talk about stuff that's connected to that clip I've just shown. I attended a book launch recently that had me thinking. The book was called The Segregated City, 100 Years of Housing Struggles in LA. Written by Andrea Gibbons, a friend and comrade who once stayed in Glasgow for a while. I think about a year, around 8 or 10 years ago. In promoting the event, the pitch was from LA to Glasgow. It goes, Los Angeles may seem a long way from Glasgow, but with a century of vibrant civil rights struggle against exclusionary housing policies and recent attempts to displace communities for boutique hotels and lofts, its current patterns of development may seem all too familiar. Walk in any direction from Glasgow city centre and the pattern of speculative development becomes obvious. And when we look a bit closer to these developments, we can detect other impacts that could follow or are becoming too often a precursor to gentrification. So what we want to look at here is the importance of making and understanding the connections with the bizarre corporate, socio-economic infringements in the form of buildings and business that are popping up in front of us each and every day, where they come from, and have not controlled their legacy of violence and people and the destruction of the social structure. So where is all this coming from? When Andrea moved back to the States, I went to visit her in LA, where she showed me around different parts of the city, where I met wonderful people, activists, organisers, and visited different groups working around Skid Row. Groups like LA CAN, which is an acronym of Los Angeles Community Action Network, and of course SAGE, Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. So these are organisations that have been established 20 or more years and have their finger on the pulse of the neoliberal project as a lived experience. So they're well worth examining if your interest is in grassroots struggle. It's also a good idea, I think, to visit the States and elsewhere, to meet people who are organising every so often to understand what will crop up in our own shores at some point, sooner or later. Particularly in the days when our own government administrations run out of ideas for controlling the domestic rabble, they will happily turn to the US for some off-the-shelf solutions that can be tailored into Tory neoliberal policy making. For instance, what is sometimes introduced to us as government solutions can look like something new thought out formula with a catchy name that can turn out to be a hack that has been played out in the States to improve capital flow to banks with the usual desired consequences for most ordinary people. We seem to inherit many terrible ideas from the States, but the other side of the story, the grassroots activism, the struggles, fighting against the neoliberal brute sometimes can go unnoticed, particularly what can be learned and is happening around black communities in the US. These communities are ahead of the curve when it comes to understanding the ways of the neoliberal project and many of the useful tactics in fighting it. So I was reminded of this experience at the book event in the CCA and on my visit to LA. One of the ideas that was being challenged by those living around Skid Row was something called the Safer City Initiative. Sounds nice. That is if you happen to be part of the group the city was being made safe for. This was a dream child of Police Chief William Bratton, a name that might be worth remembering, who who was the then acting Los Angeles Chief of Police. His claim to fame, the Safer City Initiative project, is where all of the very unscientific zero tolerance and broken windows policies came from that you may have already heard of. These flawed policies Bratton put together and introduced to cities all over the US, and as we will discover further afield. The idea of the broken windows strategy was if you attack crime at the low level of minor infractions, breaking windows, etc., it would stop the low-level criminal from developing into high-level crime. The idea was to scare the beginner lawbreaker so much that it would help them veer away from more serious crimes and, of course, completely ignoring the causes of the crime in the first place. You can see plainly today how these kinds of policies worked out for many US citizens, particularly if they happen to be black. Ideas like the Safer City Initiative can be roughly translated as how to criminalise, displace and cleanse the city of the poor, the jobless and homeless for the benefit of developers. The reason these initiatives go unquestioned and uncriticised in mainstream media is because they serve the needs of those who own the media. How these ill-thought-out police practices impact on the poor is superfluous, as their main function is to increase business expediency and advancement of the gentrifier's bulldozer. So back to Chief Bratton. Bratton, who once worked for the NYPD and was also a vice chair of the Homeland Security Council and probably other institutional bastions of corporate well-being. He was known in New York as the CEO cop for his service to business. Part of his philosophy for attracting people into the force was not better training, wages and conditions, but rather offering smarter uniforms and bigger guns. This is a quote from an article published in The Appeal, a criminal justice publication, which might indicate why we should be wary of his ideas. Bratton's approach to policing can be summed up by a statement he made in 1994 after being appointed Mayor Giuliani's police commissioner. I quote, "We're going to flush homeless people off the street in the same successful manner in which we flushed them out of the subway system." Bratton rose to national prominence in the 1990s because he excelled at using the coercive arm of the state to push vulnerable people out of public view, thus paving the way for rampant gentrification at the expense of communities that had been failed by the state. In Los Angeles, Bratton's broken window campaign resulted in thousands of tickets issued to homeless people for crimes of poverty, men who were later jailed for their inability to pay fines and fees. End of quote. Of course, Bratton's expertise has been called out by many as false, but ignored by mainstream media who prefer to believe in political policies that get the job done, i.e. criminalise the poor and clearing communities for the rich. To describe policing and those that come into contact with it in the US today as a nightmare would be a gross misinterpretation in the term. The so-called war on drugs, racism and the prison industrial complex hell that has been created, I believe, will go down as one of the darkest periods of human history. It's almost impossible to conceive the two worlds of America that exist side by side. The trauma of its people who suffer the consequences of this corrupt legislation and the trauma of its people who refuse to believe the horror is even happening and still cling to the fantasy of the American dream. So keep in mind, Chief Bratton was one of the main architects of the present US police state. So what has this to do with us in the UK, you might ask? Well, soon after I had been back from my trip to the States, maybe months, when I happened to catch a clip in the news of a SWAT team in action. They were all kitted out, top to toe in the usual shoulder pads, body armour, balaclavas and semi-automatic guns, the stuff of LA cop dramas and real life for many others. Some guy was being screamed at by one of the cops in order to lie on the ground by way of the usual expletives. It started to dawn on me that the accents were not American but English, and it wasn't LA, Detroit or Baltimore, but London. I'm thinking, Here in the UK, I was experiencing the same kind of scenario I had watched on the US Airways. And here the crime committed in one case that brought out a London armed response team was of a man shot dead for carrying a table leg in a plastic bag someone thought was a gun. So in the middle of a busy street in London, you could now be confronted by an LA-type SWAT team. I thought, where is this coming from? After Googling a bit, it became clear. Boris Johnson, the then Mayor of London, had invited none other than the said Chief Bratton over to the UK to advise the British government on how to clean up London. This was pre-Olympic Games, if you can remember that security fiasco. This was a guy Bratton awarded the CBE by the Queen for the wonderful work he'd done in the UK. The credulity is breathtaking that we honour the architects of failed policing policies that create so much misery for ordinary people, then reward them by royal appointment. But then, should we really be surprised? And not only that, around the same time when Boris Johnson was still Mayor of London, he took a dislike to and forced out Ian Blair, the highest ranking officer with Metropolitan Police. And guess what? Bratton's name came up in a discussion to replace Blair. Fortunately, he was knocked back for the job, as you need to be a UK citizen. So to get to the crux of the matter, if we move on to the present, Boris Johnson is now the unelected Prime Minister of the country, and one of the first things he plans is to put another 20,000 more police on the streets at a cost of £1 billion to make them safer, very much echoing the Safer City Initiative vibe. So we also need to ask, what was Tory thinking when they reduced the number of officers from 2010 by over 20,000 due to austerity, that we need another 20,000 under the same austerity? I will let viewers think about that. But maybe it's a clue, and who knows, maybe Bratton will get a second crack at being Police Commissioner for the London Met due to our special relationship and future new trade deal with the US. In the UK, alongside policing budgets, funding is being cut for early intervention services that could go some way to tackling some of the related issues. This is classic Bratton territory. Take a look at Baltimore, LA, Detroit, if you want to see what happens when the police are given free rein in the cause of business while intervention services are cut. Bratton and his ill-thought-out ideas appeals to those like Johnson who see communities in the form of spreadsheets, have no idea how ordinary people live. Also, people like the present unelected Prime Minister, when short of a good idea, will be happy with bad ones, no matter who they hurt or where the ideas come from, just as long as they do not harm their own privileged position. Boris is not putting 20,000 more police in the streets to make them safer for people. He's putting them on the streets to protect those who will profit most from his punitive policies and from the fallout of those who will pay dearly for them, the general public and particularly the poorest in our communities. The thing that has to be understood about these banking, family-eating, educated people is the outcomes of their decision-making doesn't matter. They're playing a game. For instance, as D.D. Guttenplan of The Nation explains, Boris Johnson treats Brexit as a game of chicken, pushing as hard as he can to see what comes out the other end, to see what can be capitalised on. He's not interested in the impact on the ground. This is a game between banking families, other European elites, and the police, who also needs to be remembered, work towards and were established to protect the interests of property owners, not us. But again, the opportunity arises within the present European chaos that we can create a real international union of people out of the mess of Brexit. We could create a Safer City Initiative to rid our streets of the surveillance state, the criminalisation of the poor for the benefit of rampant gentrification, and to stop the use of police to protect business criminals. And while we're at it, we can create a movement to stop the upper classes, the bankers, hedge funders, lords and ladies, and royalty making it up as they go along to serve the archaic pomp and ceremony that serves as the UK political system. The structures around us are in collapse, and we just can't be addicted only to hope to fix them, nor allowing a police state to keep things in check. But look around, we have all the ingredients to build the new models for doing things. It will take a massive collaborative effort, and most importantly, a drive to encourage participation in the struggle for a peaceful, sustainable existence. It's not impossible, but an imperative. As Chris Hedges reminds us, we cannot remain passive, or we are accepting the death sentence that has been handed to us by these corporate forces. We have a moral imperative to stand up with acts of sustained civil disobedience, if not for ourselves, for those who come after. I will leave you with these thoughts. We are closer to LA than we think in taking social problems and privatising them, then monetarising them, then profitising them, then criminalising them. Our struggle needs to be international. People like Boris Johnson are holding the door open for Trump. We need to open it for solidarity with all, wherever we can find them, fighting the same struggle against corporate power, or the police state is all we will have to look forward to.